Internment, a word not many know in the context of American history, but a word which impacted and will continue to impact thousands of Americans. In the face of a tragedy, Fred T. Korematsu fought for his rights as an American and a human. He brought his case to the Supreme Court, where he faced yet another tragedy. His determination allowed the triumph of Japanese Americans in the years after the case. Anti-Asian sentiments were common far before World War II. At the turn of the 20th century, the Meiji Restoration in Japan led to a surge of immigration, primarily to Hawaii, Alaska, and California. Japanese immigrants created close-knit communities while adjusting to this new world. In 1905, the victory of Japan in the Russo-Japanese War sparked a phase of specifically anti-Japanese sentiments, known as the Yellow Peril. This wave of racism manifested as the 1913 Alien Land Laws and the Asiatic Exclusion League, which restricted Japanese American rights. The racism became even worse with the Immigration Acts of 1924, which ended Japanese immigration to the U.S.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
That day, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Hawaiian naval base at Pearl Harbor.
1 hour and 20 minutes after the president's address, Congress declares war on Japan.
America had finally entered World War II. Japan did not want to provoke the U.S. into war. Rather, the country wanted to shock America into lifting its economic sanctions.
The Japanese military attack on Pearl Harbor was the catalyst that set into motion the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans.
Anti-Japanese sentiments spread like wildfire throughout America. At first, Americans stood by their loyal Japanese countrymen, but fear of another Japanese attack and the media's damaging headlines began to change that. Public racial prejudices soon began to impact President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. Japanese loyalty was brought into question. Lieutenant General John D. Witt began proposing detention plans for Japanese aliens on the West Coast, his racist reasoning being a Jap is a Jap. Although the Justice Department and FBI assured that Japanese Americans were not a security threat, the California Joint Immigration Committee pushed for removals of all Japanese Americans. February 19th, 1942 is a tragic day in history. On this fateful day, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the relocation of Japanese Americans. General John DeWitt immediately followed the order, and on April 1st, 1942, San Francisco begins evacuation. Internment was a horrendous tragedy.
They weren't detention centers, they were prisons. We were behind barbed wire, we couldn't go out. And then we were put into a 20 by 15 room. And whether there were 3 of us or whether there were 8 of us, you were supposed to make do in that room. And it was a very small room with no toilet, no running water, no kitchen, and it was cold in the winter and dusty in the summer, and pretty awful. People don't realize how devastating that was. This is Poston, Arizona. That's where we were.
It became routine for me to line up 3 times a day to eat lousy food in a noisy mess hall. It became routine to go with my father to bathe in a mass shower and begin the school day, ironically now, with the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
Japanese experience during World War II had long-term impacts, such as financial hardships, psychological trauma, and mental and physical health problems. The camps weren't only tragic. The Japanese spirit triumphed, and their experiences prepared them for post-World War I life. Overall, more than 120,000 people were interned across 16 temporary centers and 10 long-term camps in 6 states. And so, for 2 years, American citizens of Japanese descent bore this tragedy of rights. Although most Japanese Americans on the West Coast were impacted, it is important to remember that nearly 150,000 Japanese Americans living in Hawaii were not incarcerated. In a tragedy-filled time like this, Japanese Americans needed a triumph. Would Fred T. Korematsu be the one? Korematsu was a California native who believed that Executive Order 9066 was unconstitutional. Instead of packing that one bag and relocating, he underwent plastic surgery and a name change. He was still arrested and sent to the camp in Topaz, Utah. Korematsu was backed by the ACLU, who brought his case to the Supreme Court. And this is where yet another tragedy took place, now a legal one. Korematsu argued that Executive Order 9066 was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause and the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court added even more tragedy to the case. The court supported the incarceration of Korematsu. They upheld the racial targeting of Japanese Americans in a time of war.
And essentially the judges said, we're going to defer to military authorities as to what's necessary during a time of war.
The 3 dissenting justices did mention the racism against Japanese Americans, saying that as a loyal U.S. citizen, Korematsu deserves the full protection of the Constitution. 3 other cases at this time dealt with Japanese internment. The Hirabayashi and the Yasui cases, decided a year before the Korematsu decision, upheld the curfew aspect of the executive order. The ex parte Endo case, decided on the same day as the Korematsu case, ruled that the government could not detain any loyal person. The Korematsu decision acted as a loophole for the Endo ruling, and its broad decision is why it is the most well known.
Sometimes out of horrible situations, you can end up with some positive results. And again, without minimizing the harm that was done, I think there's some real triumph that you can talk about.
One triumph from the ruling is the idea of strict scrutiny. Strict scrutiny is the highest standard of review on any case about governmental discrimination. In essence, it requires a demonstration of necessity for any discriminatory law. In the years since the 1944 decision, Japanese Americans have come to triumph, and the tragedy of internment has come to serve as a lesson. Internment officially ended January 2nd, 1945. Anti-Japanese organizations were still very common, and groups like the Japanese Exclusion League attempted to stop the resettlement of the West Coast. Thankfully, many pro-Japanese groups helped with resettlement. In 1948, President Truman honored the 442nd Infantry Regiment, made up of second-generation Japanese Americans. He outlawed the California Alien Land Laws and signed the Japanese American Evacuations Claims Act, which tried but failed to properly compensate those interned. The Immigration Acts of 1952 allowed Japanese immigration once more to the United States. Japanese Americans began to recover and flourish, even triumph in a country that did them so much wrong. The 1960s redress movement, spearheaded by the Japanese American Citizens League, pushed for federal acknowledgement and proper compensation. They succeeded in their goals when Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. Since then, over $1.6 billion have been given to the impacted families. Fred Korematsu also triumphed. In 1982, historian Peter Irons discovered that the U.S. government hid and tainted evidence in the Korematsu case. The next year, Korematsu overturned his conviction through a coram nobis. He was eventually awarded a Medal of Freedom in 1998 by President Clinton. The tragic tale of internment serves as a warning for all.
Japanese Americans have turned a lot of personal and collective tragedies into triumphs to ensure that the unfair targeting of vulnerable and unpopular minorities doesn't result in something like a mass incarceration.
Racism and bias are detrimental to society. Nowadays, the Supreme Court has been setting a new precedent with race. The idea of strict scrutiny is now beneficial to minority groups. In 2018, the Trump v. Hawaii case once again brought up the issue of racially motivated actions taken by the government. Many former internees filed amicus curiae to share their experiences. In the court's decision, Chief Justice Roberts said,
Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, and, to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution.
The ongoing issue of family separation at the Mexican border is reminiscent of internment. By knowing about the tragedy of internment, about the struggle so many Japanese Americans went through, every single person can honor Fred T. Korematsu and make the country a better place by standing up for what is right.
Wishes